Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The story begins not in the cold stone cathedrals of Europe, where stained-glass depictions of Christ portray him with fair skin and flaxen hair, but under the blazing African sun, where the same Savior was seen in the image of the people, a Christ whose reflection spoke to their struggles, their hopes, and their identity. Across the vast landscapes of Africa, from the deserts of the north to the rainforests of the equator, the message of Christianity arrived not as a beacon of salvation, but as an instrument of conquest. Yet, in this imposed faith, the African spirit remained unshaken. They sought to reclaim the divine through their lens, giving rise to Africanized Christianity, a movement that dared to recast Jesus in their likeness. This Jesus was not the passive, docile figure sculpted by colonial priests, but a powerful symbol of resistance, liberation, and cultural reclamation. He was a Black Jesus, an embodiment of a spiritual revolution that challenged the colonial order to its very core. The European empires, fearing the fire of rebellion ignited by this interpretation, responded with swift and brutal suppression. What followed was not merely religious persecution, but a war on identity, culture, and the soul of an entire continent. The wrath of colonial powers descended like a storm, determined to crush any movement that sought to reconcile Christianity with African heritage. Yet, the story of Black Jesus is not one of defeat. It is a story of resilience, of a people who refuse to surrender their faith or their identity. It is the story of a sacred truth rediscovered in the midst of oppression, a truth that no amount of chains or violence could erase. And so, the tale of Black Jesus becomes a mirror of Africa's larger struggle against colonialism, a struggle that continues to inspire and reverberate through generations. As we journey into this history, we uncover not just the suppression of Africanized Christianity, but the profound significance it held in the fight for freedom and justice. We meet the preachers, prophets, and followers who dare to see God in their own image, who believe that salvation could be found not through submission but through liberation. This is the story of how Black Jesus rose in the hearts of Africa, and how the wrath of colonial powers tried and failed to extinguish him. When European missionaries set foot on African soil, they came with promises of light and salvation. Christianity was presented as a gift, a means to lead the so-called heathens from darkness into the embrace of a singular European God. Yet beneath this charitable facade, Christianity was a Trojan horse, a vehicle through which colonial powers could infiltrate African societies, dismantle indigenous belief systems, and assert control. The arrival of missionaries coincided with European expansion. The Portuguese, Dutch, French, British, and Germans, driven by imperial ambitions, saw Christianity as more than a religion. It was a tool of domination. The colonization of Africa was not merely territorial. It was spiritual, cultural, and psychological. To subjugate a people, one must first sever their connection to their gods, their ancestors, and their identity. Christianity provided colonial rulers with a convenient means to achieve this end. African spirituality, deeply rooted in the veneration of ancestors and an intimate connection to nature, was branded as primitive and demonic. Missionaries preached that salvation could only be attained through the rejection of African traditions and the acceptance of European doctrines. The indigenous gods were cast as false idols, and African rituals were labeled as witchcraft. Yet, while colonial powers sought to use Christianity as a tool of oppression, they underestimated the resilience and ingenuity of the African spirit. Christianity was not passively received. It was transformed. Africans began to interpret the faith through their experiences, their culture, and their struggles. The result was a form of Christianity that was vibrant, rooted in African identity, and wholly distinct from the cold, hierarchical structures imposed by colonial powers. Africanized Christianity emerged as a response to the dissonance between the European interpretation of the faith and the realities of African life. The colonial version of Christianity, with its emphasis on obedience, submission, and suffering, was incompatible with the lived experiences of Africans who were subjected to brutality, exploitation, and injustice. For African communities, The figure of Jesus Christ offered something profound: hope. But this hope was not found in the meek, pale-skinned Christ depicted by missionaries. Africans saw Jesus as a liberator, a revolutionary who stood with the oppressed, challenged the powerful, and offered salvation not in the afterlife but in the here and now. In this reinterpretation, Jesus became black, not just in skin tone but in spirit. He became a symbol of African pride, resistance, and resilience. Africanized Christianity blended elements of indigenous spirituality with Christian teachings. It incorporated music, dance, and storytelling, core aspects of African culture, into worship. Churches were no longer silent, solemn spaces but vibrant gatherings filled with rhythm, movement, and collective energy. The faith became a communal experience, a celebration of life, and a source of strength in the face of adversity. Leaders emerged who preached a gospel of liberation. Prophets and preachers proclaimed that the suffering of Africans mirrored the suffering of Christ, and that liberation from colonial rule was not only a political necessity but a divine mandate. This message resonated deeply with the masses, particularly in regions where colonial exploitation was most severe. Movements such as the African Independent Churches, AICs, began to gain traction. These churches rejected European dominance and sought to reclaim Christianity as a faith for Africans, by Africans. Leaders like Simon Kimbengu in the Congo, Isaiah Shemb in South Africa, and Kimpa Vida in Angola became symbols of this spiritual revolution. They preached that God was not distant, foreign, or European but present, accessible, and African. The rise of Africanized Christianity was met with fear and hostility by colonial authorities. To the European powers, this movement was not merely a religious phenomenon, it was a threat to their control. Africanized Christianity challenged the colonial narrative that Africans were inferior, incapable of spiritual sophistication, and destined for servitude. It dared to imagine a world where Africans were equal in the eyes of God, where liberation was a divine right, and where colonial rule was an affront to the sacred order. Colonial governments responded with brutality. Churches were burned, leaders were arrested, and followers were persecuted. Movements that combined religion with resistance were labeled as heretical and subversive. Missionaries who once preached salvation now worked hand in hand with colonial administrators to root out what they called pagan influences and seditious teachings. The story of Simon Kimbengu is a striking example. In 1921, Kimbengu, a Congolese preacher, began delivering sermons that emphasized healing, spiritual renewal, and liberation. His message drew thousands of followers who saw him as a prophet and a leader in their fight against colonial oppression. The Belgian authorities, alarmed by the movement's popularity, accused Kimbengu of inciting rebellion. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to life imprisonment. His followers faced severe persecution, yet the Kimbenguist church survived and grew, becoming a testament to the resilience of Africanized Christianity. In South Africa, Isaiah Shemb founded the Nazareth Baptist Church, blending Zulu traditions with Christian teachings. Shemb's church became a sanctuary for Africans who sought to reconnect with their heritage while embracing Christianity. Colonial authorities viewed Shemb's teachings as dangerous, fearing that they would inspire resistance. Attempts were made to discredit Shemb and suppress his movement, but his legacy endured. Kimpa Vida, a prophetic leader in 18th century Angola, preached a vision of Christianity that centered on African identity. She claimed that Jesus and the saints were black, and that salvation could be found through unity and resistance against colonial rule. Her teachings attracted a large following, but they also drew the ire of Portuguese authorities. Kimpa Vida was captured, accused of heresy, and burned at the stake, a martyr to the cause of Africanized Christianity. The suppression of Africanized Christianity was not merely an attack on religious movements. It was an assault on African identity, culture, and resistance. Colonial powers recognized the transformative power of Black Jesus, a symbol that inspired hope, unity, and rebellion. They sought to erase this vision, to silence the voices that dared to proclaim a God who stood with the oppressed and condemned the oppressors.